It was my parents' 35th wedding anniversary, and the backyard had been arranged to look softer than it ever had when I was growing up there. White tablecloths, borrowed heaters, neighbors carrying platters through the side gate. My mother had insisted on a catered dinner, but still asked me to arrive early just in case. I was refilling water glasses when my father tapped his spoon against a champagne flute. The conversations lowered into polite silence. He thanked everyone for coming. He talked about commitment, about loyalty, about how a marriage survives when people know their place. Then he glanced toward me. "And of course," he said lightly, smiling at the guests, "we're grateful our daughter could make it. She's always been good at helping. Not so much at much else." A few people laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. My mother adjusted a napkin beside him and added, almost fondly, "She's our dependable one. You know, the kind who stays close because she doesn't really have anywhere else to be." People heard it. No one intervened. I finished pouring the water. I set the pitcher down. I did not correct them. I did not defend myself. That's when I understood something had shifted. I used to think moments like that were small. Harmless, even. A joke that landed slightly wrong. A comment that could be ignored if I stayed steady enough. If you've ever been the person who is useful but not valued, you probably recognize the feeling. Not dramatic. Just clarifying. If this kind of story feels familiar to you, you can stay with me. That is enough. Have you ever noticed how easy it is for people to rely on you while quietly deciding you don't deserve respect? That night, I began paying attention in a way I hadn't before. In my family, roles were assigned early and rarely questioned. My older brother was the visible success. He was loud, decisive, and comfortable taking up space. My father admired that. My mother repeated his opinions at dinner as if they were updates from a news broadcast. I was the reasonable one. That was the word they used. Reasonable meant I did not argue. It meant I absorbed tension before it spread. It meant I translated my brother's outbursts into something digestible. It meant I stayed. When I was 9, my father forgot to pick my brother up from practice. I called the coach from the kitchen phone and told him we were on the way. I found the car keys. I convinced my mother not to escalate it into a fight. I remember buckling myself in and giving my father directions while he drove in silence. Later that night, he thanked my brother for being patient. When I was 14, my mother handed me a stack of unpaid utility bills and asked me to see what could be done. I called each company. I negotiated payment extensions in a voice that sounded older than I felt. When the lights stayed on, my father said, "See, she's practical." When I was 17, my brother crashed the car. I was the one who gathered the insurance documents. I was the one who explained deductibles to my mother. I was the one who sat beside my brother while my father spoke about responsibility. No one asked if I was tired. Reliability became my identity. Obedience made things smoother. Emotional containment kept the house quiet. I was tolerated because I was functional. Respected authority in our house belonged to whoever spoke the loudest. My father made final decisions. My brother echoed them. My mother aligned herself with whichever version of events preserved stability. I stayed in the background. Not invisible. Just assumed. The dependable one. The one who would handle it. The one who would not make it harder. It took me years to understand that being the reasonable one often means absorbing what others refuse to examine. As I got older, the responsibilities became more structured. When my parents started a small property management business, I helped organize tenant files. At first, it was just data entry. Then it became lease renewals, security deposit tracking, vendor contracts. I built spreadsheets because no one else wanted to. I created labeled folders, insurance, tax records, maintenance receipts. I set reminders for deadlines. I drafted email responses for my father to send under his name. When my mother forgot passwords, I reset them. When a tenant threatened legal action over a plumbing issue, I reviewed the lease and pointed out the clause that protected us. My father forwarded my explanation and received the credit for handling it firmly. I did not mind. At least, I told myself I did not. It felt like helping. When they refinanced the house, I compared loan options. I read the fine print. I summarized the terms. They signed where I indicated. Access came with proximity. Proximity came with information. I knew the account numbers, the recurring expenses, the loans tied to certain properties, the names of the lawyers who had drafted previous agreements. They saw this as efficiency. I began to see it as awareness. No one questioned why I had digital copies of everything. It was easier if I did. Invisible labor is rarely monitored. People often ask why someone does not respond when they are dismissed. In my case, reacting would have confirmed their narrative. If I argued at the anniversary dinner, I would have been labeled sensitive. Dramatic, proving their point that I lacked something essential. Silence preserved access. Compliance maintained proximity. I was not passive. I was observing. Arrogance makes people sloppy. When people assume you will never push back, they stop guarding their language. They stop double-checking paperwork. They stop imagining you as a variable in the equation. I had no interest in proving them wrong verbally. I was more interested in understanding the structure. The second humiliation happened 3 days later. My parents hosted a smaller brunch for extended relatives who had traveled from out of town. It was quieter than the anniversary party. Fewer guests. Closer seating. I was clearing plates when my aunt asked whether I was still helping with the property business. Before I could answer, my mother said, "She helps, yes. It keeps her busy." My father added, "It's good for her to feel involved." We tried to give her manageable tasks. Manageable. I stood at the end of the table holding a stack of dishes. My brother leaned back in his chair and said, "She's basically our in-house assistant. Saves us from hiring someone real." Someone real. A few relatives smiled awkwardly. One cousin avoided my eyes. My aunt asked if I had considered doing something bigger. My father responded for me. "She prefers staying close to home. Less pressure that way." There it was again. The assumption of limitation. I placed the dishes in the sink. I wiped the counter. I refilled the coffee pot. No correction. No defense. Later that afternoon, my father asked me to draft a response to a tenant dispute. He said, "You're good at this kind of thing. Simple but important." I nodded. They didn't realize what they had just handed me. After that week, I shifted from assistance to documentation. The transition was not visible. I continued managing leases, invoices, and maintenance schedules. But I began creating parallel records. Every email I drafted, I archived in a separate folder labeled correspondence. Every contract revision, I saved with timestamps. I downloaded bank statements monthly instead of quarterly. I purchased an encrypted external drive and stored scanned copies of signed agreements. The folder names were simple: property_A, property_B, primary_residence. I cross-checked rental deposits against reported income. I noted discrepancies. Some were minor accounting errors. Others were patterns. Late fees collected but not declared. Security deposits transferred between accounts. Maintenance expenses listed twice under different vendors. I did not accuse. I documented. I consulted public records to confirm ownership structures. I learned which properties were jointly titled and which required dual signatures for refinancing. I reviewed the operating agreement for the business entity they had registered years earlier and noticed a clause regarding administrative authority, specifically, the individual designated to manage records and compliance. That individual was me. At the time, it had been convenient. I had been the organized one, the one willing to sign routine filings. My parents had viewed it as clerical. I read the clause carefully. Administrative authority included access control to financial platforms. I printed the agreement and placed it in a labeled folder. I backed up the digital copy to the encrypted drive. Months passed. I built a clean spreadsheet detailing cash flow, liabilities, and potential audit triggers. I consulted, quietly, with an attorney under the pretense of career advice. I asked general questions about fiduciary responsibility, about record-keeping obligations, about liability when irregularities surface. I did not mention my family by name. Preparation replaced reaction. The more I organized, the clearer the structure became. Dependencies were laid. Accounts interconnected. Authorizations overlapping. They believed I was maintaining order for them. In a way, I was. I was simply ensuring the order was accurate. The line was crossed 6 months later. My brother had invested in a restaurant that was failing. He needed capital quickly. My parents had already extended personal loans. The business accounts were strained. One evening, my father called me into the office and placed a document in front of me. "We need to streamline authority," he said. "For flexibility." The document was a revised operating agreement. It transferred full administrative control to him alone and removed the dual signature requirement on property refinancing. My mother added, "It's just a formality. You've been wonderful helping, but this will make things easier." Easier. I read the document carefully. By signing, I would relinquish oversight and retroactively validate prior transactions. My brother stood in the doorway. "Don't overthink it," he said. "We're family." They assumed compliance was automatic. I looked up and said, "Of course. If this is what's best." Relief moved through the room. I asked for a digital copy to review formatting before signing. My father forwarded it without hesitation. That email activated a series of automated backups I had set months earlier. No one noticed. I did not refuse to sign. Instead, I scheduled a meeting with the attorney I had consulted previously. This time, I brought documentation. Spreadsheets, archived emails, copies of the original agreement. He reviewed the materials in silence. He pointed out exposure risks, undeclared income, potential audit triggers, breach of fiduciary duty. He explained that as the listed administrative officer, I was legally obligated to address discrepancies once aware of them. Address, not ignore. We filed a formal request for financial clarification through appropriate channels. We notified the registered accountant of inconsistencies requiring review. We placed a temporary hold on certain account permissions pending reconciliation. All actions were procedural, all within my authority. I did not raise my voice. I did not confront my parents directly. I allowed the structure to respond. Power shifted without spectacle. The first sign was an email from the bank requesting verification documents for multiple transactions. My father assumed it was routine. The second sign was a certified letter scheduling a compliance audit for the business entity. My mother called me into the kitchen, letter in hand, asking if I knew anything about it. I said the accountant had been notified of discrepancies that required review. Her expression changed from confusion to calculation. Within a week, 2 accounts were temporarily frozen pending documentation. Vendors began requesting overdue payments that had been deferred internally but never recorded properly. The restaurant investment was flagged during cross-account review because funds had been transferred from a property reserve without dual authorization. My brother called me late at night. "Fix this," he said. "You handle paperwork. Just fix it." I told him the process was underway. Lawyers became involved, not criminal, but protective. Asset reviews, liability assessments, structured repayment plans. The accountant requested full transparency to avoid escalation. My father stopped making jokes about manageable tasks. Family dinners were cancelled. Conversations became short. Careful. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was paperwork. There were deadlines. There were meetings where my presence was required because my signature was still on record as administrative authority. In one meeting, my father began to speak over me. The attorney gently reminded him that I was the listed compliance officer and needed to answer directly. Silence followed. Properties could not be refinanced without resolving documentation gaps. Loans were restructured under stricter terms. My brother's restaurant declared bankruptcy within the year. Personal guarantees triggered repayment obligations. Nothing I did created new problems. I simply refused to shield existing ones. My parents began reviewing old emails, trying to determine when I had changed. I had not changed. I had clarified. Eventually, they hired an external administrator to replace me, but by then the structural vulnerabilities were exposed. Correcting them required transparency they had avoided for years. There was no shouting. There was no scene where I declared victory. There was only the steady unraveling of assumptions. When the audit concluded and restructuring plans were finalized, I prepared to leave. I printed updated records and placed them in clearly labeled binders. I transferred all login credentials to the newly appointed administrator in a documented handover. I removed my encrypted drive from the office drawer and placed it in my bag. On my last afternoon there, my parents were in the living room speaking quietly. They did not ask me to stay. I walked through the house once, not to reminisce, but to ensure nothing remained tied to my name. At the entryway table, I set down the spare set of keys I had carried for years. The metal made a small, controlled sound against the wood. No one followed me outside. I closed the gate behind me. Distance changes the scale of things. When I think about the anniversary dinner now, I do not replay the laughter. I notice the structure underneath it, the hierarchy, the assumptions, the comfort of believing someone will always absorb the weight. For years, I mistook usefulness for belonging. I believed that if I remained steady enough, careful enough, I would eventually be seen as equal. What I learned instead is that systems rarely correct themselves without pressure. Silence can be submission. It can also be observation. I did not ruin my parents in the way dramatic stories suggest. I did not expose them publicly. I did not stand on a table and announce their flaws. I allowed the mechanisms they relied on to function without my protection. I respected my legal obligations. I honored documented authority. I stepped out of the role they assigned me and into the one that already existed on paper. Self-respect, for me, was not loud. It was administrative. It was reading every clause before signing. It was declining to erase discrepancies to preserve comfort. It was understanding that proximity without respect is not closeness. I no longer attend family gatherings where my presence is framed as convenience. I no longer volunteer to smooth conversations that diminish me. When people underestimate me now, I do not correct them immediately. I take note. There is a difference between being kind and being compliant. I have learned it. What shifted that night in the backyard was not my relationship with them. It was my relationship with myself. Some structures collapse loudly. Others simply stop being supported. I chose to step aside. And I have not stepped back in.